Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. I have a very special guest on the podcast, Calvin Scheller. He is on for the second time. He was actually on episode 507. We talked all about appetite. They're super good episode, super insightful. I had a ton of good feedback on that episode, so definitely go and check that out. And what we're going to talk about today is still somewhat to do with appetite. But real quick, if you aren't familiar with Calvin, he recently graduated high school as valedictorian. He began PubMeding at the age of 13, so he's been doing it for a while and has pursued a scholarly understanding of the biosciences ever since. He is currently studying bioprocess technology while maintaining a thriving coaching business. And as we talked about off air, he also has 25 jobs too that he's doing. So Calvin, welcome back on, man.
Oh man, there we go. Yeah, thank you for having me. So a little bit of a life update. I did end up finishing my bioengineering degree. So
Sweet.
I'm out of school for the time being, but the idea of going back to school for something either in engineering or in the biosciences, it's looking more enticing.
Yeah. I also feel like a couple other life updates. I mean, you got a new house as well, too. You bought that. And I'm not sure if you had the tattoos last time either.
Yeah, so I've got a fair bit of tattoos, so come up my arms. I'm not sure
Got the
how long
sleeve.
that one was. Yeah, it might have had something on my left arm. That was my first one, but this kind of my right arm has been within the past month. We did that. We got that finished. And yeah, a bit of an interesting. So a lot of people talk about their new houses. So I'm 19, so this is my first house.
That's awesome.
I think it's not surreal, but it's definitely jumping into life as early as possible. So you learn things along the way, especially when you're navigating it by yourself. So I learned a lot in the past few months trying to buy a house, taking out loans, things like that. So definitely the past few months have been busy, both with social media and with work. And then now with this new house, it's definitely I'm staying busy.
Yeah, no, that's good, man. Like you said, you're 19, so it's like you just learned, and that's super young to be buying a house in today's world. So kudos to you on that. That's freaking awesome. Like you said, you kind of learn as you go with that, and there's a lot of things you don't think about when it comes to buying a new house. But yeah, I also got the tattoo. Is it true though that once you get one, you want to get some more?
Yeah, so I had some idea. I've had idea tattoos for a while, and then I got my first one. And as soon as I got the first one, I was like, at this point, I feel prepared to get the next one. It's not necessarily that I got hooked on getting the tattoos, but after the first one happened, I was like, you know what? I'm prepared to get another one at this point. So knocked out early, and then as I learned a little bit more, trying to take care of things like that, take care of all the tattoos, trying to honestly just trying to learn as much as I can about them if I can.
Yeah, clearly you like to learn. You're a super smart guy. What about training? What are you working on there? I know you've posted some updates on social media around that, but what is training looking like for you right now? What are you working on?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, I got really sick. So I lost a lot of weight. I lost about 60 pounds in 2 months after getting sick. So right now I'm effectively gaining my strength back plus some. So I'm 100% stronger than I've ever been in my entire life. So just trying to stay on a good trajectory where I'm getting the rest that I need, given that I work so much, sometimes it's tough to fit in rest and working out and all the things. So just trying to get as much rest as I can get while also trying to maintain a pretty consistent routine. So luckily for me, I love training. It's kind of the highlight of my day most of the days. So going into the gym is easy. Recovering after the gym sometimes can be a little bit hectic, especially with the work schedule that I have. But I think right now I'm in a really good groove. But right now I do an upper lower full body split. So upper lower full body and then a rest day. And then sometimes on that rest day I'll go in and stretch. It just depends on where that rest day lies. If it lies on a weekend, those are shorter days for me. If it lies on a weekday, sometimes it just means I'll get an extra 30, 45 minutes of sleep. But really just trying to stay consistent. And like I said, I love it. So I enjoy it. I enjoy every minute I'm in the gym.
I like for 3 days a week like that. I really like that kind of upper lower full body split. That's one that I'll commonly program for clients if they're doing 3 days. And that's actually what I'm doing as well right now too. And it's just a good, again, you hit everything ideally twice a week there with that structure. And so I really like that setup versus a full body every single day there, which again, I feel like full body, some people take it as you're training every muscle group, which again, that's not the case. So what does that kind of like full body routine look like on that day? Is it like, hey, you are touching everything on that day? Or is it just when you think full body, it's like, hey, we're doing some upper, we're doing some lower, and that's full body there?
Yeah, whenever possible, I'll try and touch a little bit of everything. But I've gotten so good at knowing my body in the past few years, especially because I've been training for a while. It's just I had that kind of blip for a year or two where I just not that I couldn't train, but I couldn't train to the intensity that I wanted to, so it almost went on the back seat. So I've learned my body pretty well so that if I go in on that day where I'm supposed to train full body and my shoulders are sore or my chest is sore, I can't get full depth to begin with, then I might skip it for that day, or I might choose a different movement. So instead of doing some sort of chest press movement, I might find the cable fly that feels good and feels comfortable. So I do my best to auto regulate on the day. But most days, I feel like, interestingly, despite the schedule that I have, my recovery is really good. So I tend to recover really quickly. So I don't really go into the gym ever and feel like, oh, that's sore, except for my shoulders. My shoulders are, because of the work that I do, my shoulders are always in motion and in use. So sometimes I'll go in on that full body day and tell myself that I need to lay off the shoulders for today.
Which is tough to do. You want to build those big shoulders. I also like that routine because it gives you some flexibility throughout the week if you need to adjust as well too, right? If you have stuff that comes up. Do you find that the same for you as well?
Yeah, with sometimes, as much as I don't like to, I tend to lose sleep a lot if something big comes up. So because of, like I said, because of the schedule that I run on a normal day, if something comes up in the morning when I would be off, it just means that I might be losing sleep that day. Being able to, instead of going to the gym, take the day off and then come in the next day, or sometimes it means 2 days off and then coming in the day where I wouldn't normally come in. So it just depends, but I'm lucky that I tend to always find time. So it just depends on it's not always consistent, but lately it's been pretty consistent, which is nice.
Like you said, if you really enjoy it, you're gonna find time to fit it in, and you don't have to really worry about not getting in there. If again, it's something you enjoy and feel good with. As far as recovery goes, you said you recover really well. Do you have anything that you specifically try to do there that you think helps you with recovery or anything like that?
Man, just sleep, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't get as much as I probably should or probably would like to, and it's not as consistent as I would like it. But anytime I have time where I have a break between shifts or something of the like, I'm usually taking a nap. Or for me, so I've learned over the years that if I can get in a certain amount of sleep cycles rather than a full 8 hours at one time, it might be a 3 hour sleep or two sleep cycles here and two sleep cycles there. If I can do something like that, where it might not be one full stretch, so biphasic sleep instead of the uniphasic sleep that most people get, for me, it tends to help. So if I can get a nap in the middle of the day or take a short rest at some point in between things, that tends to help my recovery a lot. So I do notice there are some days where I might be up for 24 hours straight working because things end up coming up or I get called in. If that happens, then I do feel that my recovery is a lot worse, and as you would expect. But for me, I tend to prioritize recovery whenever possible just because of how much stress I put my body through, in a sense. So whenever it is possible, I try to get as much sleep as I can. And then I'm always typically I'm not going to tell anyone that I'm perfect, but I do my best to keep as a nutritious of a meal plan as possible. So trying to dial in my micronutrients whenever possible. But when I like to enjoy food just as much as everyone else does. So if I'm invited out to a place, I'm not going to be extremely scrutinous of everything that I'm putting in my body, if that makes sense.
Is that your biphasic sleep? Is that something that you're basing off of what you've learned in terms of research, or is that just you've just naturally just shifted towards that just based on your lifestyle?
A little bit of both. So I do know that. So it's fairly clear that if we can get in a larger sleep cycle at some point in the day, it tends to be better than trying to do like multiple hour and a half sleep cycles. So small sleep cycles, just so you can get into those deeper stages of sleep. But for me, that might look like getting 5.5 hours at some point during the day. And then if I can, go back and get another hour and a half at some point. So almost taking a nap, but trying to get a full sleep cycle in if I can. So it's effectively like a longer version of having your daily nap, except for me, that one large sleep cycle or one large bout of sleep that I get tends to be a little bit shorter than most people.
Yeah.
So my lifestyle pushes me towards that a little bit, but it seems to work really well.
And we don't want to use the age as an excuse, but my understanding of like circadian rhythm and everything like that, it is something that is a little bit more robust when you're younger. And then as you get older, it becomes a little less robust. So that's probably something that, as of right now, again, we don't want to use age as an excuse, but that is probably something that maybe it's set up that way a little bit better. Again, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I definitely think because of my age, I'm a lot more resilient than I might be if I was 25 or 26, or definitely much older than that. But the goal is right now is trying to take advantage of that.
Yep.
My long-term vision is to pay off my house actually on my 21st birthday would be nice. So the goal is my 21st birthday present to myself will be to pay off the house.
That'd be awesome.
If that happens, that puts me in a position where I can definitely pull back a lot on work. And the hope is that this online business will have built up a lot more traction by then. And then at that point, I might have already taken a lot more time off of work just to dedicate towards social media and things of the like.
Yeah. Hey, you're working with your situation rather than against it. And yeah, no, that's awesome. And by no means am I saying, oh, you're just young. That's why again, you're obviously working super hard. So I don't want that to be anything that I'm coming off as or anything like that there. One last question on this before we move on. For your nutrition, then, is there anything you feel like you have to do specifically to work around this? You have, if we go off of like circadian health, do you focus on that at all? Or is it just, hey, if there's food around and I'm hungry, I'm eating, or what does that kind of look like for you?
So there is ideals, and then there is what ends up happening sometimes. So
Yeah.
on most days, I do my best to eat when the sun is out. So I try not to eat. I work night shifts. That's a big part of the way my circadian rhythm is a little bit funky. I do my best to eat when the sun is out. So whether that be in the morning or before I go into work at night, the sun is typically out. So I tried my best not to eat when the sun goes down and when things start to get dark. Even if I'm sleeping when the sun is out with blackout curtains in my room, I still do my best to eat around that time. But then again, I also try not to eat too close to bedtime. So there's usually a time before I go into work and after I get off work in the morning, at least of that night shift, that I tend to have two larger meals. And keep those meals pretty dense with protein and micronutrients in them. A lot of times that means just going to get some sort of fruit salad bowl just because it's convenient for me, but it just depends. And then I do my best to eat before I work out if I can. Just try not to go. For me, see, this isn't for everyone, but for me, I try not to go into a workout on an empty stomach. I just prefer having some sort of food in my stomach, but obviously not too much. Whereas I know a lot of people that just train better and feel better on a fasted stomach when they go into exercise. So that's what works for me, but I'm not saying it's going to work for everybody.
Yeah, I feel like with the kind of meal timing around workouts, it really comes down to, like you said, kind of preference there. And again, my general rule of thumb is just make sure you're not going too far away from your workouts without getting like any protein in. But like you said, some people do better when they go in an empty stomach. Some people do better with some food. I personally, I'm the same as you. I don't want to be overly full, but I also don't want to be like not having eaten for 2, 3 hours because then I find that my training performance kind of goes in the shitter if I do it that way. So always try to get some food in there.
Yeah, and I think because of the kind of the way that I train, I try and train pretty intensely. A lot of times after training, I'm not as hungry as some other people
Yeah.
might be. As I tend to lose my appetite throughout the training session. So after that training session, if I've eaten a semi reasonable meal beforehand, then I can go to bed, and when I wake up, I'll have something else.
Yeah. Awesome. What we wanted to talk about today was GLP-1, very hot topic right now. You see everything all over social media, probably a ton of false information, probably some good stuff. And then you also see people say that, hey, nobody should take it. Hey, you know what you just see everything all over the place. And so we want to bring you on just because you are very into the science around this. And I feel like you have a ton of knowledge around what it actually does, the different medications. And so I think this is going to be a nice little deep dive into GLP-1. And I think, again, it will also flow very well with what we chatted about last time with appetite regulation. And so again, go listen to episode 507 on that. Calvin dives really deep into that. And again, like I said, a ton of great feedback on that episode. So let's talk about GLP-1. So again, could you maybe just walk us through what it is and what it actually does in the body? And we'll start there.
Yeah, so GLP-1 is considered an incretin hormone. GLP-1 is produced inside of the gastrointestinal tract and is produced in response to food intake. So I eat a meal and it increases my production of GLP-1. So it increases the release of GLP-1 out of my gastrointestinal tract into my bloodstream. And throughout the body, GLP-1 has a myriad of different effects. So its most notable effects include helping with blood glucose control, so helping reduce blood glucose after a meal. So that blood glucose rise that occurs after a meal, GLP-1 is a molecule that assists in lowering that blood glucose response, so getting your blood glucose back down to normal. And one of the most potent ways that it does this is by increasing the production and release of insulin from the pancreas. So it binds to receptors on the pancreas and increases insulin production. And that insulin, as many people know, is one of the most potent, if not the most potent molecule for reducing blood glucose. So it allows cells like the muscles that don't chronically take glucose out of the bloodstream to begin uptaking more and more glucose out of the bloodstream. And another huge effect that is becoming more and more notorious for GLP-1 and the medications that mimic GLP-1 is to decrease food intake. So GLP-1 has receptors inside of the brain where it binds and suppresses appetite. So it's considered an anorexigenic molecule, meaning when it binds to receptors in the brain, it reduces food intake. So GLP-1 and its medications that mimic it are becoming more popular for assisting in weight loss. Not because it does anything magical to speed up metabolic rate or to allow us to effectively not extract calories from food, but because it binds to receptors in the brain and reduces the amount of calories that we ingest. So it effectively mimics the exact calories in, calories out model that most people nowadays are becoming to realize is effectively the governor. But it does this by reducing food intake almost unintentionally. So individuals that take medications or that find ways to boost GLP-1 naturally tend to have a reduced appetite and over the course of the day, weeks, and month have reduced caloric intake and therefore see weight loss. But with that, GLP-1 also has a lot of effects around the body that a lot of people don't know about, but those are the two major ones.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into those. So again, I think the big takeaway too is like people hear GLP-1s and they think that it's just a medication. But as you said, this is also something that happens naturally in the body as well too. And again, from my understanding, it is downregulated in people that have like insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and things like that, right? Like they're missing that signal. And that could be partly what's going on in terms of people just always feeling like they're ravenously hungry.
Yeah, so it's tough. So one of the biggest things that contributes to being obese and being insulin resistant is excess caloric intake. And one of the simplest ways to eat in excess of calories is by eating foods that aren't very satiating. So we see one thing that makes food not very satiating is its lack of ability to stimulate GLP-1 production. And usually this is due to foods that are rapidly digested and that don't spend much time in the gastrointestinal tract, because the longer the time a food spends in the gastrointestinal tract, the more potent it is at stimulating GLP-1 on average. So I think it's not necessarily that people that are obese are GLP-1 resistant or anything of the, but that they're simply consuming a diet that isn't potent at stimulating GLP-1. And there's also a myriad of other factors that contribute to lack of satiety and excess appetite in individuals who are obese, but not necessarily, we don't see much around GLP-1 resistant or lack of GLP-1 production. But there are some genetic SNPs that reduce GLP-1 production at baseline or GLP-1 responses to food, or they might reduce the sensitivity of GLP-1 receptors, that those people who have those genetic mutations on average have higher body weights, but we can't necessarily use GLP-1 to explain why this population of people are obese and why this population of people are lean. But what I can say is that, again, those foods that are most potent at stimulating GLP-1 aren't the foods that most people who are gaining excess body weight are typically eating, and that's why they're so ravenous or they're not very satiated, because they're not eating those appetite suppressive foods. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said there, it's you almost can hijack your way to it to where the foods that you eat are going to be really the main player here that are going to hijack that to you don't feel full. But again, it's more so the food choice on there. And like you said, part of it is how quickly it goes through the GI tract. I'm assuming like low protein. And then you did say there are some people that genetically may get a higher response or a lower response to that. Again, that's hard to differentiate. It ultimately comes down to the food choice at the end of the day.
Yeah, in the same way that there are genetic propensities towards things like diabetes or cardiovascular conditions, there are genetic propensities that may rely on GLP-1 production and the receptor that increase the risk of obesity, but it's not necessarily something that we can explain all obesity as, or there's not necessarily a phenotype that all obese people have when it comes to GLP-1 production and sensitivity that we can make blanket statements as people who are obese are GLP-1 resistant or anything of the like.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. The more I hear about just the modern food environment, a lot of people are like, what's causing obesity? And again, we don't have to get too deep into this, but man, it's just like the food choice, I think is the big thing, right? These foods that just, like you basically just said, hijack our gut, hijack our brain, and it's just easy to overconsume them without really feeling like you're getting very many calories. And it's pretty crazy. And again, I'm going to go back to episode 507. Calvin dives deep into appetite and appetite regulation and everything like that.
Yeah, so I think there's one of the things that food distributors may not tell you about is, or that people have to learn the hard way, is that food companies are doing their best to make foods as little as least satiating as possible so that you will consume as much of them as they can. So their goal is profit margins. And this is most companies. There are companies that are focused towards health that don't have the same incentives, but most bigger food companies or most types of food that you'll be consuming or that you see in the grocery store that's packaged and made by a large company, typically they're designed in a way to make you eat more. And one of the ways that they do that is by making them not very satiating. And one of the ways to make something not very satiating is by making it rapidly digestible. So things that are really easy to digest typically are much less satiating than their counterparts that might be more difficult to digest or might take a longer time to digest. So for a very easy example, if we take something like whole grain bread and white bread, we see that the whole grain bread tends to be a little bit more satiating simply because of the intact grains. It takes a little bit longer for it to be fully digested compared to white bread, which is a little bit more almost pre-digested before you consume it. And now I'm not saying that that the differences between those two are extremely drastic, but the small differences indicate the importance of food processing and the speed in which things are digested, such that whole grain bread might be a little bit more satiating simply because it takes longer to digest. And when things take longer to digest, they make it further down the gastrointestinal tract. And this is important for GLP-1 because the cells that produce GLP-1 are located further down in the small intestine and into the large intestine. So that is, if things get digested or absorbed extremely high up in the small intestine, like simple sugars, like juices and things, then their ability to stimulate GLP-1 is diminished simply because the food molecules that we need to make it down into the lower portion of the digestive tract are already absorbed prior to getting down that far. So really the only thing that makes it down that far are indigestible matters that don't stimulate GLP-1 production.
Interesting. Yeah. So again, the key, like you said, really finding those foods that take longer to digest and they can make it down the GI tract. And that's going to be the ones that really stimulate GLP-1 production there. Real quick on like the calories, the food, you said food companies really try to find ways to make foods as least satiating as possible so you continue to eat them. From an evolutionary standpoint, if we're looking at it from that standpoint, these are the types of foods that your body just craves as well, too, right? Like these are the ones that high calorie, easy to get, don't take a lot of digestion, don't use a lot of energy to digest and consume the calories. Is that, if we think from that kind of lens, these foods are really what your brain and body craves there.
Yeah, so we think that humans evolved, the most of our evolution was spent in an environment where food was scarce, calories and energy were scarce. And it also took a lot of energy. We had to expend a lot of energy to find and or create food that we could consume without getting sick. So throughout the years, kind of evolution weeded out for people who prioritize food that is high in energy and doesn't take much energy to achieve or to get and consume. So we see that things that are really easy to purchase and bring home with you and things that are high in energy tend to be a little bit more stimulating and potent for the brain, and they become a little bit more rewarding. So a really easy example when we're talking about energy cost is it's people are more attracted to ordering in the same food that they can cook at the house simply because they don't have to expend as much energy cooking and creating that food as if they simply just ordered it in. So that's looking at the energy cost side of things. And then the energy, what we're receiving in terms of energy, we see that humans prioritize foods that are high in calories. So things that are, there are taste components of food that also make a big difference. So we don't see people just, I guess nowadays we do, but usually we don't see people just chewing on sticks of butter because it's high in calories.
Sure.
But because the taste wise, so pleasurable feelings in the mouth, so pleasure sensations, they're not as high if we're chewing a stick of butter versus if we're eating potatoes with a stick of butter melted into them. So we do see that we don't only think about energy. So sometimes we consume food that might not be high in energy, but because it stimulates different taste sensations on the tongue. But typically, so if we're consuming, let's say there are a few studies, they're not definitive, but humans tend to consume sugar beverages rather than non-nutritive sugar sweetened beverages. Or sorry, non-sugar like nutritive sweetened beverages. So we think of taking an artificially sweetened beverage versus a sugar sweetened beverage. Even if they taste extremely similar, human brains tend to actually favor the sugar sweetened beverages with calories in them almost unintentionally, simply because there is an energy benefit and there are glucose and energy receptors lining the gastrointestinal tract that sometimes, or that do have some sort of feedback loop towards the brain. I know that's a little bit of a complex milieu to explain, but I hope that made sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Like you said, you have one extreme there of, okay, we could take something super calorie dense, like you said, butter. And again, yeah, it's high energy, but that's not necessarily, it's also missing a little bit of the taste component to it, where that's really going to be that kind of magic formula where you get something that's high energy, but it also, again, is something that we know is tasty. That's really the magic kind of formula there. So there is a kind of like a point of diminishing return almost in a way with that. It reminds me of, man, what's the example I want to bring here? Like volume eating, right? Where it's like you could sit there and try to really volume eat your way to fullness, but at the end of the day, your body still is going to want some sort of energy and calorie, right? So you can only food volume your way so much to a point. It reminds me of the same thing, but maybe the opposite in a way.
Yeah, so I think there's also something to say about the satiating property of energy. So we see that energy molecules like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids, those have mechanisms by which they stimulate the production of appetite suppressing molecules. So one thing that decreases food intake periodically or acutely is increases in stomach volume. So that's where volume eating comes into play to make people feel full. But the maintenance of satiety, or the maintenance of not eating between meals, that's stimulated by also having some sort of energy molecules or appetite suppressing molecules inside that meal. So if we're eating, for example, we can drink a ton of water at one given moment and we might feel full, but not for very long because that water doesn't have any energy in it. So we might stretch out our stomach and get the sensation of not wanting to eat food for that acute moment, but we don't get some sort of satiety after the consumption of the water because there aren't energy molecules that stimulate the production of appetite suppressing molecules. So when it comes to volume eating, there's definitely tricks that we still want certain food molecules that may suppress appetite, also having a higher volume meal if that's our goal. So having things like a higher protein and higher fiber meal, which both of those molecules are appetite suppressing, but also having higher volume foods like having high water content foods. So trying to blend in molecules that we know actually suppress appetite for a long period of time, while also having a higher food volume, which might acutely cause you to eat less at that given meal.
Yep, makes a ton of sense there. Okay, cool. So in terms of GLP-1, so I guess where we should take this now is, so again, we know it's something that you can produce naturally in the body, right? When you eat, there's certain ways you can stimulate it. So maybe let's talk about the medication side of things now. I know you briefly touched on it earlier, but let's go that route and talk about that. I guess the type of GLP-1s and then the effectiveness of them.
Yeah, so if we look back in history, the first GLP-1 medications weren't actually, so right now the biggest medications we know are things like Ozempic and Wegovy, which contain the active ingredient semaglutide. And these medications bind to the GLP-1 receptor, or the active ingredient being semaglutide, binds the GLP-1 receptor and activates it the same way that our natural GLP-1 does. So in effect, we are taking a medication that mimics our natural GLP-1 and can bind to the receptors and cause the same effects, which are reducing appetite and helping to improve blood glucose control. But the original medications were actually not GLP-1 receptor agonists, but they were considered DPP-4 enzyme inhibitors. So DPP-4 is simply just the enzyme that breaks down GLP-1 inside the human body. So if we can inhibit that enzyme from functioning as rapidly as it does, the GLP-1 that we naturally produce will stay around in the body for a longer period of time. So instead of feeling a suppressed appetite for 2 hours after the meal, it might be prolonged to 3.5 or 4 hours. And over the course of the day, that makes a meaningful effect on caloric intake. But we saw that those medications, they were effective, but they weren't as effective as the new medications that we have now. And the reason is because we see that the new medications that we're producing are way more potent than the natural GLP-1 production that we have could ever be. And that is, they stick around in the body for longer, and the magnitude of GLP-1 receptor stimulation is much higher. So we see that the injection of these medications can suppress appetite such that participants are consuming 700 to 800 calories in a given day and feeling radically satiated. And they lose weight very rapidly simply because they're almost so full that they don't want to eat anything, let alone having large calorically dense meals. And now, one thing with these medications that has been put more in the limelight is the fact that these medications on average tend to lead to a bit more muscle loss than we would expect. And some individuals have proposed that these medications have some sort of muscle wasting effect, in the sense that the GLP-1 molecule can actively catabolize muscle. But what we actually see is that these medications are suppressing appetite so much that individuals' caloric intakes are going down along with their protein intakes. So one individual who's 300 pounds might go down to a protein intake of 50 grams a day unintentionally, simply because of how suppressed their appetite is. So we see that with these new medications, one thing that's important, they do wonders for suppressing appetite, but one thing that's important is monitoring the actual food that's being consumed with that small caloric allotment that you typically will consume. So trying to eat more micronutrient and more protein dense foods to help preserve muscle and also help prevent from blatant nutrient deficiencies. So these medications are effective, but they, in my opinion, and in becoming more of a medical opinion as a whole, it requires some sort of management when consuming these medications or when taking these medications by some sort of professional that can help you at least keep you accountable when it comes to how much protein are you eating any given day or how much micronutrients are you consuming, so that we don't see individuals losing weight but not having the body composition and health that they're seeking.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what you're saying there is, so these are super effective, but the issue is that now people are barely consuming any food, like you said, 600, 700, 800 calories, or again, I'm sure that's going to vary on the person. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people think that they have some sort of muscle wasting properties in them, but really the issue at play is people are not eating as much now. That in itself is not great, but then top it off with a lack of protein on top of it. And that's where you get this effect of people are losing muscle in that process. So what are some ways that you can work around that? What are some strategies that people have there to help them? Is it supplementation? What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, one of the easiest strategies is simply meeting with someone or having someone that holds you accountable for you purposely trying to get in more micronutrients and more protein in the small amount of food that you're consuming. With that being said, sometimes that can be difficult. And because of the way the GLP-1 receptor agonists alter our appetite and the specific foods that we seek, sometimes it can be really difficult for patients. They might even begin to throw up or get nauseous when trying to eat even protein dense foods, simply because they're almost so put off of food because of the medications that the idea of eating a chicken breast or a steak is off putting for them. So when we can't see individuals when we see individuals who almost physically or mentally can't consume the foods that we would need them to in their small caloric intake for that day, then supplementation becomes more and more of a target. So trying to have some sort of protein supplementation in the form of a drink, and if we need micronutrient supplementation, having that as well. But the other thing is also altering the dosage of the medication that we're taking. So there are different dosages of medication. So we see that, so we have Ozempic and Wegovy. Ozempic is targeted towards diabetes, so it's a lower dose targeted specifically towards helping regulate blood glucose. And then Wegovy is targeted more towards weight loss. So it's a higher dose specifically targeted towards suppressing appetite as much as possible and trying to allow individuals to lose weight almost effortlessly. So I've seen some individuals and some doctors are able to make this recommendation. Obviously, I can't because I'm not a doctor, but doctors are able to actually recommend individuals switch from Wegovy to Ozempic. So switch from the higher to the lower dose, simply with the same goal of trying to lose weight. But because of that lower dose, they actually consume a little bit more food and their weight loss, the speed of weight loss lowers, but they're able to consume more foods that keep their body composition in a healthy state.
Do they have, is there research on this that shows like the difference that you'll see in terms of caloric intake when you just let people take these medications, or is that something that we don't have like research on?
So it's tough to get studies passed for Ozempic for weight loss simply because that's not what the medication is.
Gotcha.
The original studies on diabetes, they do report, some of them report weight loss, some of them don't, because not all of them were looking specifically towards weight loss. We definitely see a lower rate of weight loss when it comes to Ozempic versus Wegovy, but the exact differences are a little bit vague.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you hit on, again, some supplementation potentially. I could definitely see the use of whey protein or protein powder or something along those lines being really beneficial here. Micronutrients, you mentioned that. Are there any specific micronutrients that seem to be at a higher risk of people needing on this, or is it just generally just every single micronutrient there?
It really depends on the person, so what they have an appetite for. So some people have an appetite for things like steak when they're taking the medication. So their B vitamin and all over nutrient intake tends to be a little bit higher versus the individuals that have an appetite for milk and cookies. So we see that it really depends on the person. So I do see that B vitamins tend to be a little bit lower, especially in individuals that don't eat red meat or fish. And then potassium is one that gets overlooked a lot because it's a simple electrolyte that people don't think about. But potassium is something that a lot of people tend to fall short on, even on a 3,000, 4,000 calorie a day diet, let alone an 800 calorie a day diet. So that's something but potassium is tricky along with the other electrolytes because it's a lot easier to mess up consuming potassium and electrolytes than it is to mess up consuming the water soluble B vitamins. So potassium and electrolytes are something that become important, but I wouldn't recommend doing anything with those unless you have supervision and information from your doctor about if it's okay and if it's safe for you to consume more potassium.
Yeah, because like you said, it's all about that balance there, and you can screw some things up if you go crazy with any of the electrolytes there. But that also brings up a point. I know like a kind of a common side effect that people will have with these GLP-1s. And again, maybe this has changed, but I know the kind of common thought is like diarrhea, stuff like that, stomach issues. And so I could see where, again, the electrolytes play a big role in that as well, too.
Yeah, so one thing that we don't necessarily see a lot of loose stools or anything, but definitely with these medications, we see peristalsis or gastroparesis, so almost like a paralysis of the intestinal tract. So individuals, because of the little amount of food they're eating, and because GLP-1 has an effect in the gastrointestinal tract to reduce the speed in which food moves, so it reduces gastric motility. So it reduces the speed in which food moves through the gastrointestinal tract. We see that individuals sometimes almost are unable to fully feel like they're unable to fully digest foods simply because of the way that these medications are altering their gastric motility. So there's definitely some gastrointestinal side effects that come along with these medications. And for certain people, they can be a lot more serious than others. So some people have to come off the medication entirely simply because it's causing long-term detrimental effects to the gastrointestinal tract. But it really depends on the person. And it also depends on who's supervising them and the way that their diet is comprised. Again, if you're eating really low fiber, really easy to digest, but also not nutritious foods, sometimes it's a little bit easier to fall into a trap of almost having a lot of more gastrointestinal upset, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally does. So you hit on a couple of the GLP-1s. I know there's other forms out there as well too. Like I think one would be like tirzepatide. I don't know how that fits into everything, but is that a common one or does that fall into Govy or yeah, what does that kind of look like?
So there's multiple different GLP-1 receptor agonist medications, but a lot of the new stuff are considered dual and triple agonists. So they're not just GLP-1 receptor agonists, but they're also GLP-1 and GIP receptor agonists. So they might stimulate the receptors for multiple different molecules, all of which have similar effects. So GIP is almost like a less potent GLP-1, but it's also much less potent at reducing blood glucose control or improving blood glucose control, sorry. So when we're stimulating both GLP-1 and GIP, the blood glucose control aspect of the medication is not negligent, but it's much less than a GLP-1 receptor agonist blatant. And then there's also triple agonists, which are stimulating GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon. So some of the new stuff and the new medications that you're hearing about typically are more than just GLP-1 receptor agonists. They're typically going to be dual or triple agonists.
So does that make them more like effective then, essentially?
Yeah, it really depends on the goal. And it also, honestly, in some of the studies, we don't see that they're more effective, but because they're new and fancy and they have similar effectiveness to GLP-1 and different companies can patent them, they are being rolled out at a rapid rate. So sometimes if we see dual agonists, the reason that we see dual agonists is just because a different company wanted to get on the bandwagon, but they can't just produce a semaglutide based basically Ozempic or Wegovy because those are already patented. So they come out with dual or triple agonists and they might do their own studies and find similar effectiveness and they can roll those out. And because they sound more fancy, they have their dual agonists or triple agonists. Sometimes they lure a crowd in that doesn't necessarily need them over Wegovy or Ozempic.
Interesting. So are some people, again, think I probably know the answer to this, but I would just be curious. Are some people more responsive to it than others? Are there some people who are not responsive? What does that kind of look like?
So there's not many non-responders to them, but there's definitely some people that are almost hyper responders, so they're more sensitive. But there's also people that get a lot more of the side effects than they do the benefits. We're talking again about that gastric motility and slowing down of the gastrointestinal movement. Some people experience that on a really bad level, even when they're taking Ozempic, which is a much lower dose than Wegovy. So it really depends on the person, but I think the biggest variability is almost the side effects that people experience. And I think there's a lot of myths around some like dangerous side effects like stomach cancer or liver cancer. None of those things have actually borne out in research to be true. So they don't increase the risk of any of these cancers to what we know so far. But there are some people that face the nausea and the reduced gastric motility, so almost gastroparesis, at a greater extent and a greater magnitude than their counterparts taking the same medication.
So it sounds like people are going to respond to it. It just really comes down to how much the side effects, essentially. Some people are going to have worse side effects, more side effects than other people.
Yeah, really, I'd have to go back through pretty much all the studies, but there's very few, if any, people that don't respond at all to the Wegovy dose, which is like 2.4 milligrams a week. So the Wegovy dose is a pretty strong dose and it's very potent. So there's not many people that don't respond to it. There are some people that kind of the way that they consume food is so obscure that they can still consume quite a bit of calories even taking it by just because like their diet consists of drinking half a gallon of chocolate milk a day, and that is a pretty large bolus of calories. But there's almost no one that doesn't respond at all in terms of weight loss, and then we definitely see the ratings of appetite almost unanimously go down.
Yeah. So again, you can still, like we talked about initially here, you can still hijack your brain, hijack to consume most calories. And again, this isn't, and you said this at the onset too, of this doesn't defy thermodynamics, like calorie balance, like that still is the thing here. But really what we see is if you just leave it up to people, they just take it and they aren't going crazy with it. Like you said, drinking a gallon of milk or just drinking all their calories, people will typically just eat less calories because they're just not hungry. And so they consume less, they bring less calories in. And that's really where you see this add up more than anything. But yeah, that's like the big thing I've heard is just people just don't feel hungry. They don't feel the need to eat. And so they almost just go the opposite end of the spectrum. And we already talked about lean body mass issues, micronutrient deficiencies there, other side effects. Is there any other things that we may have missed in terms of side effects or things that people overlook with GLP-1s or anything like that?
I think a lot of people look at medications as they take the medication and it fixes their problems. I think especially with these medications, and typically doctors will suggest it and it almost comes along with the medication, but definitely having someone or a medical professional that can guide you through what to eat, how to eat when you're taking these medications, I think that's important because not everyone is going to be not everyone has the knowledge to consume foods that are higher in protein and micronutrients because of micronutrient deficiencies and lean body mass. I mean, I think, again, some people see them as blatant fixes, so they don't think about what they're eating at all. So trying to have some sort of medical professional that can guide you through, at least give you some general advice for what you're doing when it comes to the dietary front, I think that's important.
Yeah. So again, it sounds like the habits are going to be the big thing. Having somebody help teach you what to eat, because again, it's going to do that to where you don't want to eat. So again, we don't want to run into those other issues. So having somebody help you with that perspective. But I've also seen it on the flip side where people say, "Oh, it's cheating. Hey, people shouldn't take this. Don't take this medication." What are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think people assign morale to how people decide to lose weight or what people do in order to lose weight. And it's not just weight loss, it's everything in life. So people assign dignity and respect towards how people decide to do things. I think that if I'm in a state where I'm having an extremely hard time losing weight, I'm perfectly fine going towards a GLP-1 receptor agonist. If I'm at such an unhealthy body weight that it's risking the health of myself and then risking kind of the things that I can provide for my family. So I think whether or not it's cheating or however you want to consider it, it's a null point because if it gets you to a healthy body weight, the opinions of others don't mean too much. But everything in life is that way. I think people, if they can't see it how they do it, or they don't respect the way that you do it, obviously within reason, I think sometimes it's more important to just let their opinions be their opinions and do what's going to set you up the best.
Yeah, just because anytime I hear someone say, "Oh, it's cheating" or whatever it is, I'm just like, okay, I'm just like, all right, they don't really understand what is going on here, and they don't really understand how like some of the issues people have when they're overweight. Yes, it's technically a choice, but at the end of the day, there's things working against them, and again, these things can help. And again, I just feel like it just shows that people don't really understand the physiology and things like that when they say that. So, like you said, at the end of the day, you have the choice. I think the big thing is, like you said, having some sort of guidance and support when taking this is just super crucial to avoid some of those negative side effects there. Now, what about coming off of them? What does that look like? What are some common issues people have there? And then long term, what are we looking at when people come off of them?
Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting battle. So it seems that one thing people think again is like they take the medication, it solves their problems, and then they come off the medication and their problems stay solved. So we see that the ways that these medications work is by reducing caloric intake. If you take the medication, you get a suppressed appetite. You come off the medication, your appetite returns back to where it was, maybe not as voracious as it was, but it returns back to a much higher level. And then you begin to gain weight back as you eat more calories, which we would expect. But some people think that you take these medications and they should work forever. The one thing that people talk about when they say you shouldn't even start these medications because when you come off, you'll just regain the weight. It does seem like without any sort of careful dietary changes and lifestyle changes, you might have to stay on these medications for quite a long time if you want to maintain that weight loss without changing anything in your life. Now, taking these medications while also simultaneously, so kickstarting weight loss with these medications while also changing your diet can be an extremely effective strategy. And then when you come off these medications, trying to implement dietary strategies that may help boost your natural production of GLP-1 and help assist in satiety and improving weight loss, those things are important if you want to maintain that weight loss. And you may not maintain the entirety of the weight loss, but you can mitigate weight regain to the best of your ability. And some people can continue to lose weight even after stopping the medication because again they can maintain a caloric deficit. So it's going to we can't really just have an unhealthy lifestyle, take the medication, come off, and go back to the same lifestyle and expect not to gain the weight back. But what we can do is use these medications to kickstart the weight loss. And if we want to come off them, carefully changing our diet and lifestyle to maintain that weight loss. Now, one side effect that does tend to come up is the fact that some people, because of the gastrointestinal issues that are caused, whether it be like a slowed down gastric motility, sometimes that can stay with the person even after they've come off the medication. So they almost have to rebuild their gastric motility and get their gut accustomed to taking more higher volumes of food and to functioning at a higher basis when they're not on the medication.
Yeah. So what does that kind of look like? It slows down because again, what they did in the medication, and then they come off of it. That's still slowed down a little bit, but they go back to eating. What typically happens there? Is it just like more worse gut issues? Or yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, it can mean gut issues. So GLP-1, the molecule itself, will again slow down gastric motility. But sometimes that can cause what's called gastric paresis, where the gut is almost paralyzed in a sense. And then that takes a while, and sometimes it takes years to come back to normal if we let it progress for a very long time on these medications. So coming back, you might try and go back to eating the same way you used to, and you'd run into some pretty severe gastrointestinal issues. So it really depends on the person and depends on how they stopped the medication and then what they did coming back from the medication. And it really is, unfortunately, it's individual dependent on how long it takes an individual to regain that gastric motility. So some people might be able to bounce back in a month. Some people it might take 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. Which is interesting. I think the gut is just a very interesting topic. And there's just so many different rabbit holes you can go down with it. But again, I feel like obviously there's things that can impact it directly, but I feel like it's something that it's impacted by so many things from a lifestyle perspective, food perspective. And then obviously, again, I'm sure there's a genetic component to it as well. Again, it sounds like that varies from person to person. And I'm sure, again, it comes back to, hey, if you can develop good habits during this, I'm sure that kind of process back is a lot easier than somebody who gets these issues and then they go back to doing what they were doing before as well.
Yeah, the gut is interesting, but also very unknown and
Yeah.
understood than people make it seem on the internet. I'll say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I know that we've done a lot of research on it and like certain straight, like just, and it's just led to more and more questions about it. So we don't know very little about it other than it's a very interesting area of research. And like you said, we don't know too much now. So you said a couple interesting things within there that sparked some more questions. So you mentioned hunger. So it comes down when you take it, it comes off. And you said there's potentially a little bit of a like hunger doesn't return fully, but I'm assuming that's just very dependent on the person there.
Yeah, so we see that people who are extremely overweight and obese have a very dysregulated appetite regulation system. So they tend to still be hungry despite carrying around loads of excess energy on their body. So we see that after taking the medication, if it induces weight loss, we can see individuals have improved appetite regulation simply because they're at a lower body weight. And things like leptin and other molecules that help regulate appetite are more in check and more in line. So we see that after weight loss, people might have better appetite regulation, but we can't expect individuals to have as suppressed of an appetite as they did when they were on the medication.
Okay, that makes sense. And then as far as when we take this from like a metabolic adaptation standpoint, you mentioned that, hey, this isn't the medication itself shouldn't have any impact on your metabolic rates, energy expenditure, anything like that. However, I could see an issue where somebody loses weight, they're eating less, that's going to impact energy expenditure on both sides of the equation there. Is that anything that we see? Is there any issue there? Or is it like just generally just how it is? Hey, once you start eating more calories, that returns? Or again, is it based on body weight? Is there anything that you can describe there or any insights there from like a metabolic adaptation standpoint or anything?
So, based on body weight, individuals' metabolic rate will slow down pretty much as we would expect. On the medication, sometimes it downregulates more than we would expect. And that's simply because of the lack of energy coming in. So there is a sort of metabolic adaptation that occurs in the midst of weight loss. But one thing that people don't talk about much and that isn't well understood is that as we begin to increase calories back up to maintenance calories, that metabolic adaptation begins to go away. So let's say a 200-pound person on average should expend 2,000 calories. If that 300-pound person loses 100 pounds and gets down to 200 pounds, they may be expending a little bit less, closer to 1,700 calories, simply because they're in the depth of weight loss. And then when they increase their calories back up to what it takes to maintain that 200 pounds, their energy expenditure will begin to increase back up to 2,000 calories. So there's a bit of metabolic adaptation that occurs in the midst of weight loss and when individuals are in a caloric deficit, but that metabolic adaptation typically returns back to normal and we expend what we would expect when we're eating maintenance calories.
Yep, that makes sense. So again, just same thing as it would be for any weight loss. Again, you're going to see that metabolic adaptation during, and then again, once you obviously adjust it for body weight, it's obviously going to lower a bit with body weight. But once you get back to eating a normal amount at that new body weight, it should get back to relatively normal energy expenditure there based on that body weight there. So that makes sense. I thought there was maybe one more thing I wanted to ask. I'm trying to think if there was, so I could see an issue here where, everything that we've talked about so far, a big issue I could see happen with taking these, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it, is somebody takes the GLP-1s, they do lose weight, but again, they're not really eating a lot of protein. They're not really resistance training like they should. They lose some muscle. They come off of it, and then they gain weight back. And so I could see where, again, if you're not careful with this kind of process, people, again, maybe a slightly lower body weight, but also I could see some issues where body composition is now altered a bit through this process. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so one thing we actually know about GLP-1 receptors or the molecule itself is that there are GLP-1 receptors on the skeletal muscle. And people don't realize that the GLP-1 receptors on the skeletal muscle actually assist in muscle protein synthesis, at least muscle amino acid recycling. So if one study that kind of opened my eyes and a lot of people's eyes is that there were studies done on elderly people, giving them GLP-1 receptor agonists, and they actually built more muscle than they would have if they weren't taking the medication, which is contrary to what we see with people losing almost an excessive amount of muscle on these medications. But these individuals were taking a smaller dose of the medication, and that small dose of the medication was simply they were getting the muscle protein sparing effects, but they weren't getting the radical appetite suppressing effects. So we see that the reason that these medications increase the amount of muscle that we lose compared to not taking the medication is because it also increases the rate that we lose weight, and it decreases, on average, it will decrease our protein intake. So we see that if we can maintain a higher protein diet, maintain a resistance training regimen, and at least trying to get in a baseline of micronutrients, there's no reason that these medications should have a radical muscle metabolizing effect. So these medications shouldn't actually break down muscle at a higher rate if we're covering all of our bases the same way that we would if we weren't taking the medication. But we see that on average, people are eating much less protein when taking the medication, and most of them aren't exercising, at least resistance training. So on average, people will lose more muscle than they probably would have if they had more of a dialed in routine. So it's not necessarily the medication itself that is actively breaking down muscle, but the way that it alters your diet and lifestyle habits.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Again, like what you do in that process is super important. But as you said, most people are not doing that though. So that's the big issue. And then they come off of it. And I could just see an issue where now they still are not doing it. Maybe they have a little bit less muscle than they already did. And I could see where that could impact body composition there. Does that kind of make sense where I'm getting at with? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that common or what? Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty common that people get down to 10 to 15% protein. And even if they're at a higher protein intake, if they're eating 800 calories, they might still only be getting in 50 grams of protein in a day. And for a 250 pound person, if not more than that's not typically going to be enough protein to spare the little muscle that they might have.
And for the deficit that they're in based on the medication there. Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting stuff. And does muscle loss, and again, this could be something that's, I think it comes back to appetite. Does muscle loss increase like appetite? Is that, I know there's the protein leverage hypothesis. Is that something that you are bought in on, or like, what is that something that would cause somebody to also see an increase in hunger? Like if they lost some?
It's tough. There's not much data on the same person with a different amount of muscle and how it alters appetite. What we do know is that the process of gaining muscle is exercise. So we know that when we exercise, muscles produce molecules that might have an appetite suppressing effect. So these are called myokines. So we see that it's not necessarily the muscle itself, but the molecules that the muscles produce in response to the resistance training to get the muscles that can help with regulating appetite. So it's not necessarily the muscle itself, but the physical movement required to become a healthier, more muscular person.
Gotcha. Interesting. We're at 2:30 here, 2:30 my time. Do you still have a little bit of time to chat, or do we need to wrap it up? I just have a few questions I want to wrap up here with us. You good? Okay. Cool. So okay, so I guess here's my other question. Is it better to slowly wean off of it, or is it better to just go cold turkey and just get off of them completely?
That's a tough question. I don't know if I have a perfect answer to that. I'll say that, in my opinion, it would be better to wean off of them, but it's also very difficult because most of these medications come in a pre-specified amount. So unless you're taking it less frequently, and then in that case, you might have periods where you're getting the full effect of the medication and then periods where you're getting no effect. So it's tough to wean off these medications unless you're going from 2.4 milligrams to the Wegovy dose to the Ozempic dose. So unless you're going backwards like that, but I'd say it depends on the person and definitely depends on how they're adjusting their lifestyle in response to coming off the medications.
Interesting. That's a good point, right? Like you said, one way to do it is to reduce the frequency at which you take it, but then you run into that issue of now you get these really high ebbs and flows with its effects there on that. Cool. Okay. So is there any other side effects or anything that we didn't go over with any of these medications?
I won't say side effects, but there are some benefits that are unspoken about. Some, especially with GLP-1 receptor agonists, there's more evidence coming out about their potential for aiding in addiction recovery. So we think of appetite just for food, but there's also appetites for things like drugs and gambling and gaming and social media, things like that. So those are also, our mind has appetites for those. And it seems like GLP-1, the receptors also have a role to play in mitigating our appetite to engage in these addictive behaviors. So we see that there's definitely a lot of data that people that take GLP-1 receptor agonists go into remission from things like alcohol abuse and drug abuse at a much more rapid rate. And then people that are using these medications, they can begin to use them to help get off of, again, these drugs of abuse that we wouldn't, even for people that are at healthy body weights, they can take these medications rather than for weight loss, but for helping with addiction recovery. So That's one thing that many people don't think about. There's more psychological to than just food intake and weight loss effects of these medications. And then there's also some inflammatory effects of these medications. They are quite potent anti-inflammatories, which is one of the reasons they seem protective against cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular complications because of the anti-inflammatory effects that they have on the vasculature and throughout the entire body. So things like pain, addiction, and kind of reductions in all-cause mortality are benefits that we see from these medications that not many people talk about.
That anti-inflammatory, is that irregardless of weight loss? It's just literally you take the medication and that anti-inflammatory effect.
Yeah, so we see that the GLP-1, the molecule itself, so sometimes you think of anti-inflammatory as it increases the production of anti-inflammatory molecules. This is an actual anti-inflammatory in which that it can bind to specific molecules and proteins, or when the receptor is activated, it instigates a milieu inside of the cells that reduces the production of inflammatory molecules. So it's not necessarily going to make you as extremely, like, you're not going to recover perfectly after a workout, if that makes sense, but it might help to reduce joint pain if you have ongoing inflammatory issues there, if that makes sense.
Yep. And then the dosage on that is just the same as what you would recommend for like weight loss in terms of the anti-inflammatory and even like the addiction issues.
It's tough. So I think in the future, we'll see more medications or GLP-1 like medications coming out at different doses targeted towards different conditions. So targeted towards things like joint pain and muscle aches, and also specific. In my opinion, I believe there's going to be a lot more studies done on things for like addiction and things like that. And that's when companies realize that once their patent life comes to an end, they need another reason to repatent the medication for another completely different thing. So that might be in the future, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, we might see a lot more studies done on kind of addiction and things like that to repatent the medication by the same company.
Interesting, man. That's crazy. What it reminds me, I hate to compare these two, but creatine, right? Where it was like just for like muscles and strength. And now we're like finding out all these other potential benefits of it as well, too, from a brain health perspective and everything there. Again, two completely different things, but I just find that interesting. Cool. Is there anything else in terms of your research around these for your article that you're writing for Alan that you found, or anything else that you want to share with the audience on this topic?
Honestly, I think we covered a lot. That
We
was
did.
not that I expected, but definitely in a more rapid pace. So I think there's not much else that I can think of, honestly. So I think that these medications will come out to have more good than just weight loss and blood glucose control than we expect, especially, like I said, for things like cardiovascular complications, not just because of the weight loss, but also because of the anti-inflammatory effects and the way that they alter in a sense, the functioning of the heart and the blood vessels. So I think there's going to be some new things that we discover, and I'm excited to see all of the things that I don't know about and no one knows about yet, or very small amount of people know about when it comes to other downstream effects that these might have, whether good or bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm sure that people are working hard at that. I guess my last question on this too, I want to leave off with this. Like, where are some misapplications of this medication, like in terms of people that will use it and things like that?
I'll say the people that are using it to lose the last 5 to 10 pounds are not necessarily that's a misapplication of the medication, but sometimes it can be more harm than good. If you're using very high doses of this medication when you're already at a low body weight, that's the population that tend to see the most side effects compared to benefits.
And are we starting to see this go in like are people using this like during bodybuilding preps and stuff like that now? Is that becoming common? Do you know? Or I'd just be curious to hear if people are using it for that reason. I could see that, I'm sure people are, but
I'm definitely hearing a lot about at the very final stages of competition prep, the use of these or other. So there's definitely some off-label, like back market GLP-1 receptor agonists or DPP-4 inhibitors are also popular in that scene because they're not necessarily as potent as GLP-1 receptor agonists, but they will extend the half-life of, again, the natural GLP-1 that we produce. So they might suppress appetite without having some of the downstream consequences of radically stimulating the GLP-1 receptor, such as like an Ozempic or Wegovy. So I do know that DPP-4 inhibitors have been used for a while. And now that there's more traction around GLP-1 receptor agonists, those and the things like Ozempic and Wegovy are becoming a little bit more common and popular in that scene.
yeah, I figured that was the case there, unfortunately. Cool. I wanted to wrap up with research coming out, things you're excited about, but I feel like you answered that right in terms of research coming out and things you're excited about with the medication. But I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add there or anything like that to wrap it all up.
No, I think with this, I have an article this month, probably the end of the month, beginning of next month, coming out with Alan that's really discussing the myths and the truths around these medications. So specifically, I already wrote a big article all about GLP-1 itself. And then this next article is going to be talking more specific about the medications and how they can alter how they function, the difference between different medications, and then dispelling some of the myths that surround the medications.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to that. Hopefully we dispelled some of those myths today on the episode as well.
Definitely, I think we covered a lot.
Cool. All right, man. Again, really appreciate your time. A ton of great information in here. I feel like this episode's going to do really well. Where can people find you?
Yeah, on Instagram. So I have a business account where that's all the educational stuff. So it's Calvin_Scheller. And then I also have more of a personal account that I started very recently at Calvin.Scheller. So very similar, where you can learn a little bit more about me. So the journey, buying a house, the things that I do outside of social media. If I get any more tattoos, which I have a feeling I'm going to get one this weekend, you'll see that. You'll be the first to see that. So that's Calvin.Scheller. And then on TikTok, it's Physiology with Calvin. And other than that, everything that I do is going to be on social media somewhere. So the podcast, the articles, you can find that right on Instagram.
Cool. All right, Calvin. Again, we appreciate your time, man. We'll have you on again in the future. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me.